The door to the king's private audience room at Buckingham Palace closed with a soft, definitive click. Outside, in the quiet anteroom, a unique piece of British history was taking shape, unseen and unrecorded. Over the course of a single extraordinary day, 5 individuals would pass through that same door, each bearing the title Prime Minister. They represented the past, the present, and the uncertain future of a nation. For King Charles III, it was a constitutional marathon, a journey through decades of triumphs, scandals, regrets, and resilience compressed into hours. This was not a reunion. It was an unprecedented moment of reckoning, a private national archive made of flesh and memory, where the weight of the crown met the ghosts of Downing Street. The September sun, filtered through the tall windows of the palace, lay in precise golden rectangles on the deep carpet. King Charles III stood quietly, his hands clasped lightly behind his back, gazing out at the gardens. The quiet was profound, a tangible presence in the room thick with portraiture and history. Today, the usual rhythm of a single weekly audience was shattered. Today, he would not just be a monarch receiving his current First Minister of the Treasury. He would be a man confronting his own long public life, reflected and refracted through 5 of its most pivotal characters. His private secretary had framed it as a necessary, delicate exercise ahead of a period of national reflection, a chance to gather perspective. To Charles, it felt more like walking into a gallery of mirrors, each one showing a different version of the country and of himself. The first audience was with Sir John Major. The king turned as the door opened. There was a comforting, familiar solidity to the former prime minister's demeanor. The formalities, the bow, the Your Majesty, were observed, but they quickly settled into the easy chairs by the fireplace. Their shared history was one of early monarchy in crisis. Charles remembered the anxious, almost paternal advice Major had offered during the Annus Horribilis, the careful guidance as the king navigated his divorce. It was Major who had sat where Charles sat now, as a young prince's marriage publicly disintegrated. "One thinks one understands the pressure of this office," Major began, his voice still bearing the trace of South London. "But until you are sitting here, receiving the boxes, realizing the sheer relentless constancy of it," he trailed off, sipping his tea. They spoke of constitutional nuance, of the changing role of the Commonwealth, a subject dear to both. But the unspoken heart of the conversation was resilience. Major had led a party tearing itself apart over Europe. He knew about weathering unrelenting storms from within one's own house. He offered no direct advice, but his presence was a quiet testament to endurance. As the audience drew to a close, Major said something unexpected. "They will judge the action, sir, but rarely understand the deliberation. Your deliberations, if I may say so, have been a lifetime in the making. That is a strength, not a hesitation." The king gave a slow, thoughtful nod. It was a benediction of sorts from the man who had witnessed the beginning of his true royal journey. A brief pause followed, just enough time for the room to be refreshed, for the atmosphere to shift. The next arrival was Tony Blair. The energy in the room changed palpably as he entered. Older, yes, the famous smile more measured, but the kinetic intensity remained. The relationship had been famously complex. The modernizer and the traditionalist, the people's princess and the heir who struggled to match her public magnetism. The memory of Diana's death hung between them, a silent, heavy specter. Blair spoke with his characteristic fluent clarity about global challenges, climate change, a shared passion, and the new shape of media. But the conversation kept circling back to the concept of modernity. We were both, in our different ways, trying to make old institutions relevant for a new time, Blair reflected. There was a frankness there, edged with a mutual, long-understood friction. Charles recalled the feeling of being advised, sometimes firmly, on how to be more like his ex-wife, of being seen as an obstacle to the project of New Britain. Yet, here they were, two older statesmen, Blair admitted. One's certainty diminishes with the years. The convictions remain, but the armor gets heavy. It was a moment of rare disarmament. They disagreed, still, on many things, but the heat of past tensions had cooled into a kind of respectful, weary realism. As Blair left, he turned. The faith leaders' initiative you mentioned last year, it's important work. The 21st century will be won or lost on that ground. It was, Charles thought, a bridge built over old battlegrounds. The morning was giving way to afternoon. The king felt the accumulating weight of the conversations, each layering upon the last. Gordon Brown's entrance was a more subdued affair. The intellectual gravity was immediate. Here was a prime minister defined by crisis, the financial avalanche of 2008. Their discussion was dense, detailed. Economic sovereignty, the Union, the rising threat of Scottish nationalism. Brown, his mind still a vault of data and historical precedent, spoke with a passionate, almost prophetic urgency about the fragility of the United Kingdom. Their relationship had been more cordial, less personally tangled than with his predecessor. Charles found himself engaging deeply on ideas of civic society, the moral architecture of nations, themes that resonated with Brown's Presbyterian soul. Brown leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. The monarchy, in a time of fracture, is not a decorative thing. It is a load-bearing wall. It must hold. He spoke of the quiet, steadying power of continuity when all other institutions are rocked. The audience felt less like a conversation between a king and a former PM and more like a strategic council from the command bunker of the state. There was a profound, melancholic agreement on the storms ahead. When Brown departed, the room felt emptier, the problems he articulated lingering like a chill. After a light lunch taken alone, Charles prepared for the penultimate meeting. With David Cameron, the atmosphere shifted again to one of familiar, if slightly strained, cordiality. They moved in similar social circles, shared a certain worldview on surface matters. But the legacy of the 2014 Scottish independence referendum and the seismic Brexit vote of 2016 lay between them like a canyon. Cameron was relaxed, polished, but there was a watchfulness in his eyes. They discussed the big society, a theme Charles had supported, and the realities of coalition government. But inevitably, the talk turned to Europe. Cameron was careful, defensive without seeming so. The referendum, it was a promise that had to be fulfilled. The genie of public demand was out of the bottle. Charles listened, his expression neutral, the model of constitutional propriety. He did not say what he truly thought, that the genie had shattered the bottle, the room, and the very house. He recalled the frantic, tense days after the vote, the utter political disintegration. Cameron, perhaps sensing the silence, shifted to safer ground, their shared interest in environmental conservation. But the heart of the audience was the unspoken recrimination. As Cameron left, he seemed to carry with him the faint, forever scent of a political catastrophe. The king felt a surge of a singular monarchical emotion, the absolute necessity to be a fixed point for the nation, regardless of the whirlwind a prime minister had unleashed, then departed. The final audience was at twilight. The room was now in shadows, lamplight pooling on the desks. The weight of the day was heavy on Charles's shoulders. The door opened for Theresa May. Her smile was small, polite, etched with the unique fatigue of someone who had navigated an impossible maze for 3 years. Her relationship with the king had been one of shared, quiet fortitude. They had both, in their different spheres, been handed an impossible Brexit brief and told to make it work. There was an immediate, mutual empathy. No grand theorizing here, no flashy reminiscence. They spoke of the grinding, granular reality of trying to govern a divided country, a divided parliament. The endless ifs and buts, May said, her voice dry. The feeling that every path was mined. Charles nodded. He spoke, more openly than he had all day, of the frustration of watching from the sidelines, bound by silence, as the political process convulsed. It was a conversation between two survivors of the same protracted, exhausting siege. They understood each other's scars. May, in her understated way, was perhaps the one who most viscerally understood his current role. She had stood before him, asking for dissolutions, and prorogations, watching his unwavering, neutral mask, knowing the human concern behind it. "Your constancy, your majesty," she said as she rose to leave, was a quiet virtue in a very noisy time. It was noticed. It was the greatest compliment of the day. Silence returned. The king did not ring for the lights to be turned up. He sat in the gathering dark, the 5 conversations echoing in the chamber of his mind. He was no longer just Charles. He was a vessel containing 5 decades of British history. He had been son, heir, troublemaker, mourner, campaigner, and now sovereign. Each prime minister had seen a different facet, needed a different version of the man beneath the crown. From Major's steadfastness to May's grim perseverance, he had seen the arc of the nation's recent soul. He felt, finally, not weary, but strangely solidified. The mirrors had shown him not fragmentation, but a composite, enduring picture. He was the continuum. The door had closed on the past. His duty now was to the present. He stood, a silhouette against the window, and prepared to face the tomorrow that these 5 yesterdays had built. The morning light came softly through the tall windows of the king's private room at Buckingham Palace. It was a quiet room, filled with the weight of history. Paintings of past kings and queens looked down from the walls. The furniture was old and elegant. On this particular morning, King Charles III stood very still by the window. He looked out at the green gardens below. His hands were held together behind his back. He was a man known for thinking deeply, and today his mind was full of thought. Today was not a normal day. It was a day that had never happened before in all the long history of the British monarchy. Normally, the king meets with the prime minister once a week. They talk in private. No one else is there. It is a famous part of the British system. But today, the schedule on his desk was different. It listed not 1, but 5 meetings. 5 different people, and each of them held, or had held, the title of prime minister. They were coming one after the other, like chapters in a history book coming to life. Sir John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May. Each name brought back memories. Each name represented a different time in the country's life, and in his own life. For King Charles, this was more than a series of meetings. It was like walking back through his own past. He would have to speak with men and a woman who had seen him as a young prince, as a troubled husband, as a passionate campaigner, and now, as an older king. He felt a strange mix of feelings. There was a sense of duty, of course, but there was also a quiet curiosity, and maybe a little tension. What would these conversations be like? What old memories would they bring up? The idea for this day had come from his private secretary. The country was in a period of change and reflection. It seemed a good moment, the secretary had said, to gather wisdom from those who had led the nation, to hear their perspectives on the challenges of today. The king had agreed. It was a sensible idea. But now that the day was here, it felt very personal. He was not just a king gathering advice. He was a man about to meet 5 people who had been central characters in the story of his adult life. Some relationships had been warm. Others had been difficult. Some were simply professional. But all of them mattered. He took a slow breath and turned from the window. The clock showed it was almost time. The first chapter of this long day was about to begin. The door opened without a sound. His assistant private secretary came in. He gave a small bow. "Your Majesty," he said, "Sir John Major has arrived." The king nodded. "Thank you. Please show him in." The assistant left, and the king walked to the center of the room. He straightened his jacket. He prepared his face into a look of calm welcome. This was his role, to be steady, to be a calm host, no matter what feelings were inside. The door opened again. There stood Sir John Major. He was old now, his hair white, but he stood with a familiar and solid posture. He was wearing a well-tailored suit. His face was serious, but kind. He stepped into the room and performed a respectful bow. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice warm and recognizable. "Sir John," the king replied, stepping forward to shake his hand. "Thank you for coming. It is very good to see you." The handshake was firm. "A great pleasure, sir," Major said. They exchanged a few words about the weather and the travel to the palace. It was the normal, polite talk that helps 2 people settle into a room. The king gestured toward two comfortable armchairs that were placed near the fireplace. A small table was set between them with a teapot, cups, and some plain biscuits. They sat down. For a moment, there was a comfortable silence. The king poured the tea. He remembered his first meetings with John Major. They were decades ago. Major became prime minister when the king was still the Prince of Wales. It was a time of great personal difficulty for the royal family. The king's marriage to Princess Diana was falling apart in front of the whole world. The newspapers wrote about it every day. It was a painful and public time. And then, the next year, there was a huge fire at Windsor Castle. The queen had called it her annus horribilis, her horrible year. Through all of that, John Major had been the prime minister. He had been a steady, sensible presence. He had offered advice to the queen and to the prince. He had understood the pressure they were under. "It feels like a very long time ago," the king said, handing a cup of tea to Sir John. "Those early days of your premiership." Major took the cup and saucer. "It does indeed, sir. Another world, in many ways." He took a slow sip. "I was thinking on the way here about the sheer pace of change since then. The world feels a different place." They began to talk about those old times, not in great detail, but in a general way. They spoke of the changing role of the monarchy in modern society. Major had been a supporter of the institution. He believed in its value as a symbol of stability. "The public mood can be a fierce thing," Major said, looking into his tea. "It can turn quickly. In politics, one learns that. But the monarchy, your majesty, must ride above those turns. It is a difficult balance. To be relevant, but not to be swayed by every passing wind." The king listened carefully. He agreed completely. He had spent his whole life thinking about this balance. As Prince of Wales, he had tried to be relevant. He had started charities. He had spoken out on issues he cared about, like the environment and architecture. Sometimes people criticized him for this. They said a royal should stay quiet. But he believed he had a duty to use his voice for good. Now, as king, the rules were different. He had to be more careful, more neutral. It was a change he was still getting used to. "You once gave me some advice," the king said, looking at the fire. "During that difficult period, you said that private troubles must be endured with a public face. It was simple advice, but I have always remembered it." Major nodded slowly. "I remember that conversation, sir. You were carrying a great burden. I merely stated the obvious. The duty always comes first. It is the price of the position, a price you have paid with great dignity, if I may say so." The compliment was sincere. The king felt its warmth. Here was someone who had been there at the beginning of his real trials, someone who had seen the struggle up close. They moved on to talk about the Commonwealth. This was a subject both men cared about deeply. The king is the head of the Commonwealth, a role he takes very seriously. Major spoke about the importance of the organization as a link between nations, a force for good in the world based on shared history and values. They discussed the challenges it faced. It was a thoughtful, slow conversation. There was no rush. The clock ticked quietly on the mantelpiece. As the tea was finished, the talk became more reflective. Major spoke about the nature of leadership. "When I left Downing Street," he said, "I felt a tremendous sense of relief, of course, but also a strange emptiness. The constant pressure, the endless flow of boxes of papers, the decisions that affect millions, it stops suddenly. And then you're just a person again. It takes some getting used to." The king thought about this. His own role had changed, but the duty had not stopped. It had increased. He would never have that feeling of it stopping suddenly. His duty was for life. "I cannot imagine that sudden stop," the king said. "For me, it has been a gradual change of responsibility. But the core of it, the service, remains the same." "Precisely," Major said. "Yours is the long view. Politicians come and go. We have our moment, for better or worse. But the crown is the constant. In times of great national stress, that is what people look to. They may not always articulate it, but they feel it. They need that symbol of continuity." The king felt the truth of these words. He had seen it himself during times of national mourning or celebration. People turned to the monarchy as a fixed point in a changing world. It was a humbling thought. It was also a heavy responsibility. After about 45 minutes, Sir John Major knew it was time to go. He had another meeting after this. He placed his cup and saucer back on the table. He stood up. The king stood as well. "Thank you, Sir John," the king said, shaking his hand again. "This has been most valuable. And thank you for your service then and now." "It was an honor, Your Majesty," Major replied. He gave a final small bow. "I wish you great strength for the rest of your day. It is a remarkable undertaking." With a last kind smile, Sir John Major turned and walked to the door. He let himself out, closing the door softly behind him. The king was alone again. The room was quiet, but it felt different. The first conversation had been warm, like talking to an old friend who understood the rules of the game. It had been a good start. He walked back to the window. He saw Sir John's car drive away through the palace gates. One down. For to go. He took a deep breath. The next meeting would be different. He knew that. The next was Tony Blair. A staff member came in quietly to clear the tea things and bring a fresh pot. The king asked for a glass of water. He needed to clear his head. The relationship with Tony Blair was the most complicated of all. When Blair became prime minister, he was young, full of energy and new ideas. He talked about New Britain. The country was excited. Princess Diana, so beloved by the public, had just died. The royal family, and Charles in particular, were seen as cold and out of touch. Blair understood public mood perfectly. He was the people's prime minister, while Charles was struggling to be the people's prince. There had been times when Blair's government had seemed to give advice to the royal family, telling them how to be more modern, more like Diana. It had been hard to take. There had been a famous tension between them, not a public fight, but a private coolness. Now, more than 20 years later, they were both older men. Blair had lived a global life since leaving office. Charles had become king. How would this meeting go? The king finished his water. He heard a gentle knock on the door. It was time. The door opened. Tony Blair walked in. He was still slim, his hair now gray, but he moved with the same quick energy. He smiled widely. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice still clear and confident. He gave a respectful bow. "Mr. Blair," the king said, stepping forward to shake his hand. "Welcome. Thank you for making the time." The handshake was firm and brief. "A unique invitation, Your Majesty." "I was very intrigued," Blair said, his eyes taking in the room. He had been here many times before, of course, but not for many years. They sat in the same chairs. The new pot of tea was between them, but the feeling in the room was already different. It was more electric, less calm. "How have you been?" the king asked, starting the conversation. "Very well, thank you, sir. Busy. The work of the Institute keeps me engaged with many of the issues we use to grapple with in government." "And yourself?" "The new role must keep you immensely busy." "It does," the king agreed. "It is a learning process every day." The first few minutes were like this. Polite, careful. They spoke about safe topics. They talked about the Middle East, where Blair still did a lot of work. They talked about climate change, an issue they both agreed was critical. The king felt a sense of relief. Maybe this would be easier than he thought. But then Blair leaned back in his chair. He looked at the king with a direct, thoughtful gaze. "You know, sir," he began, looking back, it was a remarkable time, the late 90s. A moment of great optimism for the country, but also a time of tremendous upheaval for many institutions. Here it was. The king kept his expression neutral. Yes, it was a period of significant change. The monarchy was part of that conversation about change, Blair continued, choosing his words with care. The public sentiment after Diana's passing was profound. It demanded a response. The king nodded slowly. He could feel old feelings stirring. The memory of that time was still sharp. The grief of the nation, which he shared as the father of her children, but also the anger that was directed at him and the rest of the family. The pressure to show emotion in public, to be something he was not naturally, and the sense that Tony Blair, with his perfect words, understood the public better than he did. "It was a difficult period for my family," the king said, his voice even. "The loss was deeply felt, privately and publicly. The expectations were challenging to navigate." "Of course," Blair said quickly. I did not mean to suggest otherwise. It was an impossible situation for anyone. My point is only that the country was in a state of flux. My job was to manage that national mood. Sometimes that meant offering perspectives to all sorts of national institutions. The king understood what he was saying. Blair was explaining, not apologizing. He was saying that he was doing what he thought was best for the country, and that included advising the monarchy on how to connect with the people. At the time, it had felt like interference. Now, with the distance of years, it could be seen as part of a prime minister's job. The public mood was a force of nature, and Blair was trying to steer it. I believe we were both, in our different ways, trying to do what we thought was right for the nation's future, the king said. It was a gracious thing to say, and he meant it. The heat of those old disagreements had faded. Blair seemed to appreciate it. He smiled, a more relaxed smile this time. I believe that is true, sir. We had different roles, different tools, but the goal one hopes was similar. He paused. Time gives one a different lens, doesn't it? The convictions of youth are tempered. One sees the complexities one might have missed before. This was a surprising admission from Tony Blair, a man known for his certainty. The king found himself nodding in agreement. It does. One sees that change must be handled with care. That tradition also has its value. It provides roots. They talked for a while longer about the modern world, about the rise of social media, the spread of misinformation, the challenges to democracy. They found more common ground here. Both were concerned about the coarseness of public debate. Both believed in the importance of dialogue between faiths, another passion of the king. As the audience drew to a close, the atmosphere had changed. It was not warm like the meeting with Major, but it was respectful. There was a mutual understanding that had not been there before. They had history, and it was complicated, but they had survived it. They were both elder statesmen now. Blair stood up. Thank you for your time, Your Majesty. And, may I say, I have admired the tone you have set since your accession. It feels thoughtful and needed. Thank you, Mr. Blair. That is kind of you. Safe travels. Tony Blair gave a final nod and left the room. The door closed. The king let out a long, slow breath. That had been the meeting he was most nervous about. It had gone better than he could have hoped. There was a sense of closure. A page had been turned. He looked at the clock. It was nearly lunchtime. He had 2 hours before the next audience. He felt tired already, emotionally drained. These conversations were not small talk. They were journeys into the past. He decided to have a light lunch in his private sitting room. He needed to be alone to rest his mind before the afternoon sessions. The first part of this historic day was over. The calm beginning with Major and the complex dance with Blair were done. Next would come Gordon Brown, a man of deep intellect and serious passion. The king prepared himself for a different kind of conversation altogether. He walked out of the audience room, his footsteps quiet on the thick carpet, carrying with him the echoes of the 2 prime ministers who had helped shape the man and the king he had become. The afternoon sun had moved across the sky. It now shone through a different window in the king's private room. The light was stronger, more direct. It showed the little specks of dust dancing in the air. The king had returned from his quiet lunch. He felt a little restored. The simple meal and a few minutes of silence had helped. But the weight of the day was still there. It was a weight made of memory and expectation. He had spoken with 2 prime ministers from his past. One conversation had been like putting on a comfortable old coat. The other had been like carefully folding away a complicated piece of fabric, finally smoothing out its wrinkles. Now he had to prepare for a third. Gordon Brown was next. The king stood by the fireplace, thinking about the man. Gordon Brown was not like Tony Blair. He did not have the easy smile or the quick words. He was a thinker, a man of deep, serious mind. He felt things strongly. His time as prime minister had been defined by a global crisis, the financial crash of 2008. He had been the chancellor for 10 years before that, in charge of the country's money. Then, he became prime minister just as the world's banks were starting to fall. His was a story of huge pressure and intellectual force. The king's relationship with him had been professional, focused on the work. There was less personal history, less tangled emotion. But that did not mean it would be an easy conversation. Gordon Brown cared deeply about big ideas, fairness, justice, the union of the United Kingdom. And he spoke about them with a powerful, almost burning passion. There was a knock on the door. It was time. The king took his seat. "Please show him in," he said. The door opened, and Gordon Brown entered. He was a tall man, and he seemed to fill the doorway. His hair was grayer, his face more lined than during his time in Downing Street. But his eyes were the same, intelligent, intense behind his glasses. He walked in with a sturdy, purposeful step. He gave a respectful bow. "Your Majesty," he said, his Scottish accent clear and firm. "Mr. Brown," the king replied, rising to shake his hand. "Thank you for coming. Please sit down." The handshake was strong and brief. Brown sat in the chair, his posture upright. He did not seem relaxed. He seemed ready to engage, to discuss. A fresh pot of tea was on the table. The king poured. "I trust your journey from Scotland was not too difficult." "It was fine. Thank you, sir," Brown said. He accepted the cup, but placed it on the table in front of him. He was not a man for small talk. He was a man for big talk. The king understood this. He appreciated it. After the careful dance with Blair, a direct conversation might be refreshing. They began by talking about the global situation. The financial crisis was the obvious starting point. Brown spoke about those frantic days and nights. He talked about the phone calls to world leaders, the emergency meetings, the fear that the whole system might collapse. It was, he said, leaning forward, his hands clasped together, a moment when the abstractions of economics became very, very real for every family in the country. People's savings, their jobs, their homes. It all hung in the balance. The king listened intently. He remembered that time. He remembered the sense of national anxiety. He had visited communities as Prince of Wales, seen the worry in people's eyes. It required extraordinary action, the king said. It did, Brown agreed, his voice low and serious. And it required working with others internationally. No one country could fix it alone. That lesson, I fear, is being forgotten. He paused, then moved the conversation to where his heart truly lay, the future of the United Kingdom. The possibility of Scottish independence was a deep, personal worry for him. He was a proud Scot and a proud believer in the Union. "The bonds that hold us together are under great strain, sir," Brown said, his passion obvious. "Not just in Scotland, but across the nations. There is a feeling of distance, of separation. The economic pressures, the sense that some places are left behind. This is the fuel for division." The king nodded. This was a subject close to his own duties. As king, he was the head of state for England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The unity of the kingdom was a cornerstone of his role. "It is a central concern," the king said. "The sense of shared purpose, of common ground, seems harder to find. It must be nurtured," Brown said, almost urgently. "It cannot be taken for granted. It requires work, not just from politicians, but from all parts of national life." He looked directly at the king. "In this, the monarchy has a role that is unique. Above politics, a symbol of that shared history and shared future." They talked for a long time about community and society. Brown spoke about his work with charities, about his belief in the power of people coming together. The king spoke about his own Prince's Trust, the charity he started many years ago to help young people. They found common ground here. Both believed in the importance of giving people a chance, of building from the ground up. It was a meeting of minds on the level of ideas, not personality. Then, Brown said something that surprised the king. "You know, sir, during the worst of the crisis, there were moments of profound doubt. The scale of it was overwhelming. In those moments, the rituals, the constants, they mattered. The weekly audience here, the formal opening of Parliament, there were points of stability in a world that felt it was spinning out of control. People may not say it, but they feel it. They need that anchor." The king was quiet for a moment. He had never thought of it quite like that. He knew the monarchy provided continuity, but to hear it described as an anchor during a storm by the man who was steering the ship was powerful. "That is a very generous observation, Mr. Brown." "It is a true one," Brown replied simply. "Leadership in a crisis is lonely. But Knowing the institutions of state are holding, that there's a foundation that does not shake, it allows a prime minister to focus on the storm. Your role, sir, provides that foundation. The conversation moved on to the future. They talked about technology, about the changing nature of work, about the challenges for young people. Brown's mind moved quickly from one big topic to another, always connecting them back to themes of justice and fairness. The king found himself challenged and engaged. This was not a nostalgic look back. This was a fierce look forward. After almost an hour, Brown's energy seemed to settle. He finally picked up his teacup and took a drink. It had gone cold. He did not seem to mind. He looked around the historic room. I have always felt the weight of history in this palace, he said. But today, talking about the future here, it feels right. We must learn from the past, but our duty is to those who come next. The king agreed completely. As their time drew to a close, he felt a deep respect for Gordon Brown. Here was a man who carried the concerns of the nation like a physical weight. His intellect was a tool he used not for personal gain, but to try and solve big problems. He was a serious man for serious times. Thank you, Mr. Brown, the king said as they both stood. Your perspective, as always, is deeply thought-provoking. I'm grateful for your time and your candor. The gratitude is mine, Your Majesty, Brown said, shaking the king's hand firmly. This is an important conversation. We must all think of how to serve the common good. He gave a final, stiff bow and turned to leave. He walked out with the same purposeful step with which he had entered. The room felt different after he left. It felt charged with the energy of big ideas and heavy responsibilities. The king was alone again. He walked to the window. He saw Gordon Brown's car depart. 3 meetings were done. Each one had been a world of its own. Major was stability, Blair was change, Brown was intellect and union. He had a short break before the 4th audience. He felt the mental tiredness returning. These conversations were like reading different books from the same library, one after the other. Each required full attention. He sat in his chair, closing his eyes for a few minutes. He did not sleep. He just let the thoughts settle. The next meeting would be with David Cameron. This brought a new set of feelings. David Cameron was from a more familiar social world. They knew many of the same people. They shared interests in the countryside and conservation. Their relationship had generally been good, polite, and cordial. But the shadow over David Cameron's time as Prime Minister was long and dark. It was the shadow of the referendum on European Union membership, the Brexit vote. Cameron had called the vote, believing he would win. He had lost. The result had torn the country in half. It had changed everything. And then Cameron had left, resigning the morning after the result. He had stepped away from a storm he had created. The king's role during that time had been intensely difficult. He had to remain completely and utterly neutral. He could not show a hint of an opinion. Inside, he may have had deep concerns. He saw the division, the rising anger, the confusion. But as the monarch, his face was a mask of impartiality. He had to support the prime minister of the day, whoever it was, and whatever policy they pursued. Now he was about to meet the prime minister who had set that enormous change in motion, and then left. How would Cameron be? Would he be defensive? Would he be regretful? Would he pretend it was all fine? The king did not know. He finished his break and stood up, straightening his tie. The clock showed it was time. David Cameron entered the room with a relaxed smile. He looked well, dressed in a smart but casual suit. He had always carried an air of easy confidence. Your Majesty, he said, with a cheerful tone. He gave a bow. Mr. Cameron, the king replied, shaking his hand. Welcome back. It's been some time. It has, sir. Too long. This is a wonderful idea, these meetings. Cameron sat down, looking around. The room hasn't changed a bit. A comfort, in a way. The king poured tea. The atmosphere was indeed more casual than with Brown. They started by talking about shared interests. They discussed the environment, a topic both cared about. Cameron talked about his work with conservation charities. The king talked about his own forests and farms. They spoke about the importance of protecting nature for future generations. It was pleasant and easy, but the unspoken subject was there, filling the space between them. It was like a large piece of furniture they were both carefully walking around. They talked about Cameron's time in coalition government, sharing power with the Liberal Democrats. Cameron spoke about the challenges of compromise. It requires a different skill set, he said. You have to listen more, negotiate constantly. It's less about command, more about persuasion. The king nodded. A useful skill in many areas of life, he said politely. Then, after a pause, Cameron brought it up himself. He leaned back slightly. Of course, the referendum was the defining event. It's strange to think how long it has dominated everything since. The king kept his expression neutral, interested but not opinionated. This was his trained skill. It was a significant moment for the country, he said carefully. It was, Cameron agreed. He looked thoughtful. I believed it was the right thing to do, to settle the question. The party was unhappy. The country was debating it endlessly. A clear vote, in or out, seemed the democratic way to resolve it. He spoke calmly, as if explaining a logical decision. There was not yet a tone of regret. And the public spoke, the king said, simply stating the fact. They did, Cameron said. He took a sip of tea. The result was not what I expected, nor what I campaigned for. But it was the result. I believed then, and I believe now, that when you ask the people a direct question, you must accept their answer. That is why I resigned. It was the correct constitutional thing to do. The king listened. He understood the logic, but he also thought of the years of chaos that followed. The bitter arguments in Parliament. The second Prime Minister, Theresa May, trying and failing to get a deal. The deep divisions in families and communities. The feeling of a nation stuck. He could say none of this. His role was silence. It set a complex process in motion, the king said, choosing his words like stepping stones across a river. It did, Cameron admitted. More complex than many envisioned. The negotiations with Europe were always going to be tough. The details are fiendishly complicated. He paused. I watch from the sidelines now. It is a strange feeling. You set a great boulder rolling down a hill, and then you're no longer the one steering it. This was as close as he came to acknowledging the consequences. The king sensed no great apology, but perhaps a faint recognition of the scale of what he had started. Cameron was not a man who liked to dwell on difficulty. He was an optimist by nature. He quickly moved the conversation back to more comfortable topics. He asked about the king's transition to the throne, about the coronation. He spoke warmly about the late queen. The king answered politely, but inside he felt a distance. Here was a man who had unleashed a historical force, and then walked away from the practical, grinding reality of managing it. The king, by contrast, could never walk away. He had to stay and be the constant through all the fallout. He had to meet weekly with Theresa May as she tried to pick up the pieces, seeing the exhaustion and strain on her face. He had to maintain unity when the very word unity felt like a joke. The audience with Cameron was pleasant on the surface, but it felt shallow compared to the deep, heavy conversations with Brown or the charged history with Blair. It was like discussing the weather while standing in the aftermath of a hurricane. After a suitable amount of time, Cameron looked at his watch. I should let you prepare for your next guest, sir. It has been a great pleasure. They both stood. Thank you for coming, Mr. Cameron. My best to your family. Thank you, Your Majesty. And good luck with the rest of your day. A fascinating experiment. Cameron gave his easy smile and a nod, then left the room. The door closed. The king did not move for a moment. He felt a mild sense of emptiness after that meeting. It had been cordial, but it had not touched the core of things. Maybe that was the point. Maybe David Cameron's legacy was one of surface over depth, of a gamble that did not pay off. The king pushed the thought away. It was not his job to judge. His job was to listen. He had one last audience. The final prime minister of the day, Theresa May. He looked at the clock. The late afternoon light was turning golden. He was tired, truly tired now. But the thought of this last meeting gave him a different kind of energy. Theresa May was different from all the others. Her experience was the most recent and, in many ways, the most similar to what he felt now. She had not chosen to fight a referendum. She had been given the job of delivering its result. She had been handed an impossible task, a divided parliament, and a ticking clock. and she had worked day and night with a stubborn, quiet determination until she could do no more. He understood that. He felt a kinship with her. They had not had a long personal history, but they had shared a specific and terrible kind of pressure. They had both had to show a calm face to the world while managing a kind of internal chaos. He respected her resilience. He wanted to hear what she had to say. He took a few minutes to use the bathroom and splash water on his face. He drank another glass of water. He needed to be present for this last conversation. It felt important. He returned to the room as the sun began to cast long shadows. The room was quiet, waiting. Soon the door would open for the fifth and final time. The last prime minister would enter, and the long, unprecedented day would reach its end. The golden light of late afternoon filled the room now. It was a softer light, kinder on the eyes. The long shadows from the window stretched across the carpet like fingers. King Charles stood in the middle of the room, feeling the quiet settle around him once more. He had just sent David Cameron on his way. The polite, somewhat surface-level conversation was over. Now he waited for the last visitor of this very long day. Theresa May. He felt a different kind of anticipation for this meeting. Not the nervousness he had felt for Tony Blair. Not the intellectual readiness he had needed for Gordon Brown. This was something else. It was a sense of shared experience, of a burden understood. Her time as Prime Minister had overlapped with his final years as Prince of Wales and the very beginning of his time as king. They had lived through the same political earthquake. But where David Cameron had triggered the quake and left, Theresa May had been the one sent into the ruined building to try and make it safe. She had stayed, working in the dust and danger until the structure threatened to collapse on top of her. He thought of her weekly audiences during those chaotic years. She would come in, always perfectly dressed, always polite. But he had seen the deepening lines of exhaustion around her eyes. He had heard the hoarseness in her voice from endless speeches and debates. He had watched her hands, sometimes clasped so tightly in her lap that the knuckles were white. She never complained. She was a model of stoic British resilience. And he, bound by his constitutional role, could only offer a listening ear and a steady presence. He could not give advice. He could not take sides. He could only be the calm in the center of her storm. It must have been a lonely feeling for her. He understood lonely duty. A gentle knock came at the door. It was time. He took a slow breath and turned to face it. "Come in," he said. The door opened, and Theresa May entered. She was dressed in a deep blue suit, elegant and simple. Her face was familiar, a little older, a little more relaxed than during her premiership, but still with that air of careful control. She stepped inside and gave a neat, respectful curtsy. "Your Majesty," she said. Her voice was clear and measured. "Mrs. May," the king replied, walking forward with a warm smile. He extended his hand. "How very good to see you. Thank you for coming." She shook his hand. "It is an honor, sir. Thank you for the invitation." The greetings felt more genuine, more grounded than some of the others. There was a mutual respect here that did not need to be performed. He guided her to the chairs by the fireplace. The last pot of tea of the day sat waiting. He poured for them both. "How have you been keeping?" he asked. It was a normal question, but he meant it. "I have been well. Thank you, sir," she said, accepting the cup. Life beyond the front line of politics is quieter. It allows for different kinds of work, different kinds of thought. She gave a small, wry smile. "I have been writing and walking. Lots of walking." The king chuckled softly. "Walking is a great cure for many things. I find it essential." They began by talking about simple things. Her home, his new role. They spoke about the charity work they both continued to do. The conversation was not forced, but it moved slowly, as if both were carefully approaching a much larger subject. They were two people who had shared a trauma, and small talk was the safe ground around its edges. After a few minutes, Theresa May placed her cup back on its saucer with a soft click. She looked into the fire for a moment, then turned her gaze to the king. "This is a remarkable thing you are doing today, sir. Meeting with all of us. I've been thinking about it all week. It feels significant. It feels necessary," the king replied honestly. to understand the road the country has traveled from those who are driving at different points. Your perspective from what I might call the most recent and difficult leg of the journey is particularly valuable. She nodded slowly. A silence fell, but it was not uncomfortable. It was a silence of shared memory. It was a difficult leg, she said finally, her voice lower. I often thought during those audiences we had how fortunate the country was to have the continuity you provide. The world outside that door was, she searched for the right word, turbulent. But in here was always order. It was always calm. That ritual mattered. The king was touched. Gordon Brown had spoken of the monarchy as an anchor. Theresa May was speaking of it as a sanctuary, a quiet room. It is designed to be so, he said, a space for confidential conversation away from the noise. But it is more than the room, she said. It is the person, knowing that one would come here every week and be received without judgment, without an agenda. It was a point of stability in a schedule that had no other points of stability. Every other meeting was a negotiation, a confrontation, a plea. This was, she paused again, this was a constant. The king listened, his head slightly tilted. He had never considered his own presence in that way. He had seen himself as a listener, a constitutional formality. But she was describing him as a source of human steadiness. It was a humbling thought. Your own constancy was noted by many, the king said. The determination you showed. It was formidable. The word made her smile a real smile, one that reached her eyes. Stubborn, some might have said, she replied. Then the smile faded. It was a task that required a kind of tunnel vision. You could not look too far ahead because the path was blocked. You could not look left or right because the criticism was coming from all sides. You could only look at the next step, the next vote, the next speech, the next compromise. She was describing a kind of political purgatory. The king could imagine it. The relentless, grinding pressure with no clear way out. It seemed an exceptionally heavy burden to carry, he said gently. It was, she admitted, looking down at her hands in her lap. This was a level of openness she had never allowed herself in their weekly meetings. Then, she had been the serving prime minister, needing to project strength. Now, she was a former prime minister, speaking to the one person who had witnessed the strain without being part of the political fray. There were times when I would sit in the car on the way here, just trying to clear my mind, to put the chaos in a box for 45 minutes. And I would sit there, she gestured her chair, and you would ask about my family or about a local issue, and for a moment, it would remind me that there was a normal world still turning outside of Westminster. It was a gift. The king felt a profound sense of sympathy. He thought of all those Wednesdays. He had asked those questions out of politeness, out of a sense of duty to show some human concern. He never knew they were a lifeline to normality. I am glad if it provided even a small respite, he said, and he truly meant it. They talked then, more freely, about the nature of the Brexit process. Not about the politics of it, but about the mechanics of it. The sheer complexity of undoing decades of legal ties. The difficulty of explaining that complexity to a public who just wanted it to be over. The frustration of dealing with a parliament that could agree on what it didn't want, but never on what it did want. I think the public grew so tired of the word process, May said with a sigh. They want an outcome. But in a democracy, the process is the outcome. You cannot separate them. That was the hard lesson of those years. The king nodded. He had watched that public frustration grow into anger and disillusionment. He had seen it in the letters people sent him, in the mood of the country during his travels. The national conversation became very strained, he observed. It became broken, she corrected softly. The language became one of betrayal and treason on all sides. It was impossible to bridge. When language fails, democracy struggles. She looked at him. That is where symbols must speak, where actions of unity, of simple human kindness, must try to do the work that words cannot. Your visits, sir, during that time, to communities across the nations, they were more important than perhaps even you realized. He remembered those visits, to factories, to town halls, to farms. He would listen to people's worries, their confusion. He would shake hands, and offer a sympathetic ear. He could not solve their problems, but he could show that the institution of the state still saw them, still acknowledged their struggle. He had considered it a basic part of his job. She was telling him it was a vital one. The conversation shifted to life after leadership. She spoke about the strange feeling of sudden irrelevance. One day, every word is analyzed, every move watched. The next day, you're just another person trying to book a train ticket. It is a very sharp cliff edge, she said. For you, sir, of course, it is different. Your service does not end. In a way, you are fortunate. The purpose remains. Yes, the king agreed. The purpose transforms, but it does not vanish. I imagine the adjustment for a former prime minister is profoundly difficult. It is an identity crisis, she said simply. You have to learn who you are when you are not the job anymore. It takes time. She looked around the room. Coming back here today, for instance. It feels familiar, but I'm a different person coming through that door. I am not carrying the boxes. I am not preparing for prime minister's questions. The weight is gone. But so is the... She trailed off. The mission the king offered. Yes, the urgent daily mission. They sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating the different shapes of duty and their endings. The fire crackled softly. The light in the room was growing dimmer, the golden hue deepening into orange. The mission continues for you, sir, she said, turning back to him. In a broader form. You spoke in your first address of serving with loyalty, respect, and love. I have thought of that phrase often. In the heart of the political machine, those words can feel very distant. But you have placed them at the center of your task. It is a powerful statement. The king was surprised she had remembered his words so exactly. They're the only principles that make sense for such a role, he said. Without them, it is just ritual. Empty ritual. Precisely, she said, her voice firm. And in a time when people trust rituals less and less, the humanity behind them is everything. They must see the person who is serving, not just the crown. I believe they are beginning to see that with you. It was perhaps the most direct and meaningful compliment he had received all day. It came not from a place of political calculation or historical analysis, but from a place of shared, hard experience. She had seen the machine from the inside. She knew how easy it was for humanity to be crushed by it, and she was acknowledging his effort to keep his own humanity visible. As the sky outside turned to twilight, their conversation wound down. They had covered so much ground, not in terms of policy, but in terms of feeling and experience. It had been the most human conversation of the five. Theresa May glanced at the darkening window. I should let you rest, sir. It has been an immensely long day for you. They both stood. The king felt a genuine reluctance to see her go. This audience had been a kind of healing closure, not just for the day, but for a difficult chapter they had both endured. Mrs. May, he said, shaking her hand with both of his. Thank you. Thank you for your honesty today, and thank you for your extraordinary service during a period of unparalleled difficulty. The country owes you a great deal for your steadfastness. Her eyes seemed to glisten for a second in the firelight. She was not a woman who showed emotion easily. She gave a small, tight smile, a nod of gratitude for his words. The duty was mine, your majesty, and it was an honor to serve. To see you now, embarking on your own great service with such thoughtfulness, it gives one hope. She curtsied once more. Good evening, sir. Good evening, Mrs. May. Safe journey home. She turned and walked to the door, a neat, dignified figure in the fading light. She opened it, stepped through, and closed it behind her with the softest of clicks. And then there was silence. Absolute, complete silence. The king did not move. He stood in the center of the room, now lit only by the glow of the fireplace and a single lamp. The door had closed on the fifth and final prime minister. The historic day was over. The marathon of memory was run. He felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, a physical and mental tiredness that went down to his bones. But beneath the tiredness, there was a strange and solid calm. He walked slowly to the window and looked out at the darkening gardens. The first stars were beginning to appear in the deep blue sky. He thought of 5 people, 5 lives, 5 leaderships. He had known them all. He had been a prince, an heir, a problem, a survivor, and now a king to each of them. They had shown him different facets of a nation's life, its steadiness, its hunger for change, its intellectual passion, its reckless gambles, its gritty endurance. The conversations replayed in his mind, not as words, but as feelings. The comfort from Major, the complicated peace with Blair, the intense, intellectual challenge for Brown, the polite, surface-level exchange with Cameron, and, finally, the deep, understanding resonance with May. He was not the same man he had been that morning. The meetings had acted like a refining fire. The anxieties, the curiosities, the tensions he had felt at the start had been burned away, leaving behind a clearer sense of purpose. He saw his role, now, not as a series of reactions to different prime ministers, but as the single, continuous thread running through them all. He was the connection between those eras. He was the living archive of that national experience. His job was not to rule. It was to remember, to steady, to represent the long story of which these political chapters were just a part. The politicians fought the battles of the day. His duty was to guard the meaning of the nation itself across the decades. He turned from the window. The room was full of shadows, but he did not turn on more lights. He sat in his chair by the dying fire, letting the calm settle into him. The door had closed on the past. The audiences were done. Tomorrow, he would return to the present. There would be the red boxes of government papers to read. There would be visits to plan, ceremonies to perform, a current prime minister to advise and be advised by. But for now, in the quiet dark, King Charles III sat alone. He was a man who had walked through his own history and come out the other side. He was tired, yes, but he was also, more than ever before, sure. Sure of his place, sure of his duty, sure of the quiet, constant strength he was now required to provide. The unprecedented day ended not with a bang, but with a profound and peaceful silence, and a monarch ready for all the tomorrows to come.